let's go ahead and jump into this and talk a little bit about security and compliance as it relates to the cloud. I try to boil it down and make it simple and not too verbose, right? It comes down to two things. When you're talking about checking and evaluating your organization's posture or stance as it relates to the security of your cloud environment as well as the compliance of your cloud environment. It comes down to either lack of visibility or a lack of degree of automation. Now that second one is an interesting one, but I mean it. And as we just saw in Jorge's presentation with some of the standards and frameworks and out-of-the-box stuff that comes from GCP, it's fantastic, but you need the resources to be able to do it and automated resources to be able to apply it, especially when you have a cloud environment that's spinning up and spinning things down 20, 30, 200, 2,000 times a day, right? So those are kind of the two domains that we're going to go over. Having a lack of visibility and having a low degree or no automation in the environment that you're building. So what ends up happening is most organizations think that they're going to be cloud or, meaning it's going to be one or the other, right? We're all technologists here. We understand an or statement evaluates true whether or not one condition is true. But in this instance, we're talking about you pick one, right? You either are cloud and have your environment in the cloud, or you're secure. But the reality of what we are building and what we want you to get to is having a cloud presence and being secure, or having a cloud presence and being compliant, right? So what's happened in the past? And I'm not one to throw down the newspaper and put the gloom and doom tied to something, but I just wanted to highlight some of the more public breaches or incidents that we've had. So there was a misconfigured compute instance that was set up by an organization, caused an issue, right? As it relates to other major breaches, right? A misconfigured database that ended up exposing public records of their customers for quite a long time. Other famous organizations, and apologies on this build out, somebody else got control of my deck. I don't normally do build outs. Other issues or breaches that have happened, that are famous, that happened a year or two ago. As it relates or tied to the storage, right? So again, exposure, right? Misconfiguration, something wasn't done. Question, how many of these were compliant at the time of their breach? The answer is probably all of them, right? And the other question you should be asking is, what standard are we measuring their compliance against? Of course, that varies by the vendor or by the technology company that we're evaluating. So how do we get there? What do we do? And how do we build that out? So a couple of things before we jump in. Typically there's big and heavy concerns from your organization standpoint around the cost, right? How much is this going to be? I don't want to invest a lot into this just to be compliant, right? Again, visibility makes sense. We've talked about that. Then comes, well, actually, I just want to, hit the low bar, right? Just get me to compliance, or just get me to as secure as I need to be for this amount of spend. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying this is what happens at every organization. The last is the reporting that's tied to something, right? We're unable to get the visibility or get the information about the compliance or setup of the environment because we don't have the reports or capabilities of it. But key factor to differentiate is that security does not necessarily equal compliance. You can be compliant and insecure. And it just happened in those 4 examples that I was talking about, right? With those organizations, you have many different standards with which you're trying to comply with. And the compliance standards themselves are written to be generally non-specific. Some standard might just say, hey, you have to make a reasonable effort to secure your customer's data. Great. Well, a reasonable effort to secure my customer's data could be encryption with, a SHA-1, 64-bit encryption algorithm. That's reasonable. I go to some senator and told them, hey, your data is encrypted with this with the blowfish algorithm. That senator is going to be like, oh wow, great, thank you so much. I'm so happy that my data is encrypted by the blowfish algorithm. that senator is not going to have any idea that that algorithm was compromised, right? So being secure does not necessarily mean being compliant, and being compliant does not necessarily mean that you're secure. Now, of course, it's getting better. Of course, there are some better frameworks, more specific frameworks, better practices, more specific practices that are leading to one of these being the same, but it's not exactly the same. The other component that you have to kind of take into consideration, if I go back, is just kind of that minimum benchmark, right? A lot of organizations are just striving for the bare minimum, and that's it. And as Jorge shared, you do have some resources, right? I'm going to advance this slide out just so that it builds. And forgive the poor graphics here. The point behind this is that you've got these shared responsibility models, right? And you've got these best practice frameworks. So these are the well-architected frameworks of AWS and Azure here. So there is a sort of guideline for what and how you should build out your environment based on some best practices that are provided from the cloud providers. Now, these cloud providers have seen how things have been done at your organization, at a million organizations, or tens of or hundreds of thousands of organizations. So they've got a pretty good understanding of what best practices should look like. You can use those resources as a starting point and as a place to build. And the good news is, as you saw in Jorge's presentation, there are some security-minded frameworks or best practices that are built out by the cloud providers. Google's a great one that's security-first focused. Azure has a security pillar that's part of their well-architected framework. AWS also has a security pillar that's part of its well-architected framework. So they go through and tell you, hey, here's what you need to do. Here's how you need to be secure. Here's the baseline. That's where they stop. Okay? Where do we pick up? Well, first and foremost, as Ron mentioned, if you're in a multi-cloud environment, your Google Cloud dashboard, which is fantastic and gives you PCI compliance and HIPAA compliance reports out of the box, is not going to connect to your Azure instance and environment and tell you the same thing. Could your Azure environment tell you the same thing? Maybe. Do you want a picture of everything across all your clouds all the time? Yes, right? So what and where the cloud providers are great are giving you that baseline, giving you kind of their standards-based approach that's off of the best practices that's surrounding the model that they built from a shared responsibility standpoint, as well as a best practices for well-architected standpoint. But remember, it's a shared responsibility model. It's in the word, shared responsibility. There is responsibility for you to do something correctly and to do something securely and to do something that is compliant. All of those things and more, right? So here's your organization's opportunity to step up. This is where you can come and build out your environment. Now, that being said, what do we see? Well, at Trend, we have lots of research going on, a huge research arm with tens of thousands, if not 100,000, some odd customers all over the world. So we have a rich set of data that we can pull information on and tell you, hey, here's what's happening. So here's what's happening. We are seeing the same set of issues time and time again with the configurations of people's clouds, and those rely to storage. Jorge mentioned that Google encrypts its storage out by default. That's fantastic. The other cloud providers don't. If you missed that checkbox, or if you didn't check the environment correctly, or if you tagged your storage environment incorrectly, you're going to have an issue with storage. Maybe your keys aren't rotated correctly. Maybe your keys aren't encrypted in the right way. Maybe the application doesn't access the keys in the right way. Maybe your identity access management is incorrect. Maybe your logging is too permissive, overly permissive, overly permissive, or under permissive, or not turned on. Maybe you've got something that is related to the validation, the authentication, and the authorization of a user. Regardless, this isn't necessarily a new story. We were screwing this up back when we were doing things on-prem with the 7 layers of the OSI model and however we built out our environment. So good news, we're consistent. Bad news is, we're still doing the same thing that we did time and time again. So we've got to fix and learn from our issues. So what else, kind of has or ties to this is, as I mentioned, that sort of multi-cloud view, right? If you've got a cloud environment that's beyond just one dashboard or one setup, you're going to need a broad visibility across your whole cloud. So how does this work as it relates to what we're building and how we're configuring our environment, right? You'll see this term misconfigurations, right? We'll talk about how a cloud environment is configured. Gartner says this, we say it at Trend Micro, the NSA says it. Back in January, mid-January, the NSA released a report that said most of the breaches through the next 3 to 5 years will be caused due to cloud misconfigurations. So it's one thing when we say it, we're a vendor. It's another thing when Gartner says it. They're kind of neutral, and well, they're neutral in the sense of what they're publishing, and they're trying to be for your benefit. You have to have a paid subscription to access them, is what I was saying. It's another thing when a 3-letter agency from a government says it, right? And so what ends up happening, and how does this work? Well, you are building applications. Those applications are being built at a high velocity. Those applications are being built and torn down continually. It's like the pets versus cattle analogy, right? These aren't pets anymore, these are cattle, and you take them out and spin them right back up as they need to be taken out and spun up according to your application or launch release windows. And what ends up happening is as you're building these, you have issues. You might be using software-defined infrastructure. You might be using infrastructure as code. You might just be building and spinning up these environments. But either way, as you're going through and doing them, any sort of configuration on the front end leads to all sorts of issues. Misconfiguration on the front end leads to all sorts of issues on the back end, right? And so those issues that we talked about compound, right? So as you take those issues and you put them out into production, you will find that you have something that messes up the relationship to how your container is set up, right? Or how your files are stored, or how your keys are managed, right? And when you build in the visibility, and you build in the compliance, and you build in the security, notice those are all separate verticals and all separate components, you tend to have a much more resilient and risk-averse environment. Note that I'm not saying perfect. The perfect environment does not exist, period. End of story. It doesn't. What we want is a managed and visible environment. And what we're able to provide you with when we plug into all the right places, those right places being the releases, those right places being kind of the services that are being used, the cloud environment, the configuration of that environment, the containers that are put into that environment, the network traffic that goes to and from that environment, the applications that are being stacked or built in that environment, right? All that has to be done and taken care of and built in a proper manner, or shown in a proper manner. So here's an example. One of the things that we like to do or say at Trend is weaving security into the DevOps pipeline. Note that I am not saying a term called dev, S-E-C, sec, ops. I'm saying DevOps. I'm saying weave security into DevOps, but I'm not using two different terms there. Because when you weave security into DevOps, it simply just becomes another more mature DevOps process. And that's really what you want to aim for. You want to aim for a mature DevOps process that has security and compliance woven into it. And that's it. So when you are building your environment, when you are making and adding the appropriate steps into the way that your code is committed, into the way that your software-defined infrastructure is built, then you have a much more, I'll say, secure rather than compliant organization, cloud environment or setup, and you have it built in such a way that you've got visibility and the ability to go through and see what's happening to that environment. So here, from a continuous integration standpoint, we're able to provide solutions that integrate into that life cycle and see what's happening with triggers and with configuration events or event-driven, I'll say, notifications to be able to see and tell you what and how effective the environment that you've built out is. And oh, by the way, it's also really helpful to make certain that when the auditors come and when the people or customers ask, hey, you know, how compliant is your environment? How does your environment relate to security? You're able to provide that, right? So as Jorge mentioned, you know, Google's got some of this built in. We've got this obviously built in across cloud, from agnostic to the cloud that you're using, so that we're able to tell you, hey, you know, when you're going to do your GDPR audit, we're confident that your cloud environment was secure and compliant at the time that it worked. Two different things, secure and compliant. Note that I'm saying that time and time again. And I'm doing this in an automated fashion, right? So one of the other things that I said was a lack of resources and the lack of automation. When you build this in, you have this in an automated standpoint, you're able to do this quickly. So I can integrate into the way that you build. Perfect world, developer goes, sits down at their desk, log into their development environment, they see a ticket, the ticket is in Jira, the Jira ticket says, hey, change these encryption keys, rotate them correctly. Developer does that, fixes it, submits the build coordinator moves that on. There was no security involved there. There was no compliance person involved there. It was just a DevOps process. That's what you want to get to. That's where we take you, and that's how we help you build out kind of your environment. So remember, the goal is managed risk, right? Notice that line does not go to 100. Doesn't exist. We're able to help you get to managed risk. Get to the point where you're comfortable with the environment that you're building and comfortable with the process and the methodology that you're using to build that environment so that your risk is appropriately managed. What we at Trend provide is a cross-platform, cross-cloud view of your cloud environment, from the application to the containers to the configuration of that environment, to the workloads and the data that's being transferred, all in one simple place. What I specifically am encouraging you to do is look at the configuration of your environment, to do continual assessments of that, set up across a multi-cloud view to be able to build and maintain and take care of a mature, integrated, you know, sort of cloud build process. That red diagram right there, off to the left here, if I go to my laser pointer, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about building security into DevOps, right? It's not DevSecOps, Ops, it's just DevOps, and we've been able to integrate security into it. So we weave it into the pattern and the way in which people build. We build it off of various frameworks, but we go plus plus. We add the visibility, we add the security component to it, we add the automation, and we make an environment that is healthy, managed, and visible or reportable to you and for you and for you know, your customers or your internal audiences or groups that you're building these environments for the business units for. So we offer you the capacity to go through and do this. It takes a matter of moments, just setup of your accounts, a connection to the environment, quick scan, and you know, the data's reported back to you, and you're able to see this. Very quick, very easy, very visible, and very automated.